that have some joyful days, we will always sing your praise. Mary, Annabelle, remembrance for you from the whole class.
Where is she? She's not going anywhere. Just thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm speechless. I can't.
Well, we expect a poem.
Yeah.
I'll have a poem next week. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Roses are red, that's right.
Okay, I can give. Thank you.
Brings again where we left off last week. Will I go to the amplification? Does that help? Turn it on? I'll leave it on for now and see how it goes. Last week I tried to give us a little bit of background to the sonnet, the bachelor, and I have, as I mentioned last week, I have broken up the 154 sonnets into various groupings. I don't want to do only the most famous sonnets. We want to read some that are not famous as well. But I'm not averse at all to being relaxed about the sequencing of looking at Shakespeare sonnets this week and next week. And I thought before we started, I would ask if you had any favorites that we do not want to miss for sure. As I did last week, I'll ask you again next week. Is there any Shakespeare sonnet that you want to start off with just to get us going into the proper mood?
123.
123. This is no time thou shalt not boast that I do change. Okay? All of those of you who have your text with you can turn to that. Start off with that. This is not one that I thought about doing today, so we'll see what comes of it. No time thou shalt not boast that I do change. Thy pyramids built up with newer might to me are nothing novel, nothing strange. They are but dressings of a former sight. Our days are brief, and therefore we admire what thou dost foist upon us that is old, and rather make them foreign to our desires, and think that we before have heard them told. Thy registers and thee I both defy, not wondering at the present nor the past. For thy records and what we see doth lie, made more or less by thy continual haste. This I do vow, and this shall ever be, I will be true, despite the sighs and thee. Didn't you pick an unusual one? This is one I have not taught in the past. I think I've only read it 2 or 3 times. More impromptu than I might do usually. There's an obvious feature of this poem. It's something that strikes anybody who reads, who actually sits down and takes in any number of Shakespeare sonnets. And that is, if he has any continuing theme, it's a fascination with what time is and what time does. And it's more present here than in, I think, any of his plays, though the issue appears over and over again. But the sonnets raise this issue. I've often thought about Shakespeare, what was growing old in man individually? One of the critics that I reviewed before I sat down to think about the sonnets, before bringing them to you, said that the great virtue of Shakespeare's sonnets is that when you read other Elizabethan sonnets, what happens is that the unique voice of this man comes through. And I'm not sure what that even means, because people have always seen in Shakespeare's plays the uniqueness of his voice in terms of their own perception. And Shakespeare is hard to pin down as a person. But it's hard to read the sonnets without thinking that, in fact, time as a phenomenon, the fact of aging, is something that he considered seriously and personally, and perhaps, I've thought, made him want to write sonnets, and sonnets tend to have this as a conventional topic. And this appears here. I was going to, if you had no volunteer topics, I was going to start off today by reading half a dozen or so of the first 20 sonnets in which Shakespeare addresses the young man, essentially saying, time is passing. If you don't reproduce yourself and your beauty, it will be lost forever. And then I wanted to raise the issue of time. I hadn't intended to go back as far in the sequence. Let's look at it. What does the second word tell you is the recipient of the sonnet Yeah, he's speaking to time. The use of father beside later on implies that father time is involved here. So it's a figure representative of what it means. Thou shalt not boast that I do change. What is the cliche? Obviously, about life. Time and change go hand in hand, right? Life must be a recognition of a continual process of evolution. And in terms of human beauty and human maturity, time is the inevitable reaper that takes us down. And the poet's statement is something that appears in 10, 12 of the Sonnets, is that the only defense against time for the poet is, what would it be? His poetry, sure. You will die, I will die, we will all decay, we'll fall into senescence someplace, but this poem will last. And so he's going to continually focus on the issue, you shall not boast that I do change. It's reminiscent of John Donne, isn't it? You think you're so powerful, but you're not. There are other ways. But Shakespeare is not going to take this into a religious statement, which is what Donne does, in Death Be Not Proud. He's going to keep it on an artist's angle of vision. I see a hand back there?
Well, I was just saying that when you know the finiteness of your own being, then that is almost a prayer. I mean, the poet realizes that poetry that human being is.
But what you're doing is praying that through your production it can last. I don't know what this means in real terms, in terms of the poet's attitude towards his work. I don't know what made it possible for Dickinson, who refused to have her poetry published, to write that her paradise or heaven would be that people would continue to say her name throughout eternity. And she didn't expect her poetry to be published. At least she didn't, unless she knew the nature of her sister Lavinia better than we might expect. But still, a poet who puts words to the page does see that that is paradise. And Shakespeare makes the same statement in poems that he doesn't expect to be published. He didn't publish them; they were published apparently without his consent. So it's an interesting issue. I think maybe there's a lot of truth to that. Do poems live when they're not being read? Is there a Does Beethoven's Seventh Symphony exist when it's not being listened to? I don't know. I have a strong personal belief that no poet writes poetry in the expectation that it will be filed away. In fact, I have a friend right now who's a former student from many years past who is a significantly accomplished poet, in my opinion. And this woman will not publish her poetry. And I'm telling her over and over, send this out. Get used to sending it out. Send out a poem every day to a journal someplace. And she's totally resistant to the idea. But I do not believe, I know her fairly well, I don't believe that she doesn't believe that her poetry is there forever for other people to see. I'm not a person who believes that poets write for themselves. And I think in order to write poetry, you have to have an intense ego. And ego means you want to be read. It's an interesting issue.
But couldn't it be like sensitive, that's their way of getting in touch with, I mean, maybe.
Well, yes, I wouldn't deny that there's a lot of the self involved. Someone like Edward Taylor was clearly writing poetry to help himself prepare for the Eucharist as a priest. He was a Puritan minister, as you know. And his meditations are meditations intended to clarify his mind before he goes through communion. It's also true that he did not discard them, that he saved them, put them together carefully, and that the end product of his life was that these were willed to Harvard University. So you start asking, what are the deeper levels of meaning in such an experience? I will be convinced that a poet is writing only for himself and not forever when he burns his poems as he writes them. And I don't know many poets who do that. Certainly none of the living poets that I know who are friends of mine do it. They always keep copies. And as with Dickinson, copies end up in friends' hands, as happened in her case with Helen Hunt Jackson, and because she got one of those poems, one of them ended up published before Dickinson was dead. So all of this, I guess, is a preface to saying that I personally believe that the impulse to write poetry is an ego egoistic and egocentric impulse to be seen speaking permanently. I don't think people write poetry for themselves. And I think Shakespeare was well aware of that, and that is expressed over and over again in sonnets. As long as these poems live, which for us has been, what, 300 some years? Yes, 300, almost 400 years. So there's an element involved. Maybe you would think about it as we go on and see if you think there's some truth to it. I hope that we do some of the pro forma sonnets as well. That's a great one to see if we can catch that quality as well.
But don't you think that's a means of communication, too, that the poet would have? Not necessarily with his contemporaries, but with himself. He may not be able to express himself except maybe by poetry, which doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be for the public.
I can't deny that. I think it's a heavy impulse, especially for poets, and all good poets who are looking for the rightness of the word, the rightness of the phrase. But I don't think this is true repeatedly. There's plenty of evidence, for example, in the first 20 sonnets here, that Shakespeare was playing with a convention. He repeats this motif for 20 sonnets. And you put them together, some of the sonnets are good, some are indifferent. A few of them are actually bad sonnets. It's hard for me to believe that this is an intense self-exploration.
Playing for the gallery.
He played for the gallery. Yeah. How well can I do what other people do well? Can I repeat other people's phrases? So I don't think that the impulse in Shakespeare's sonnets is going to be universally, maybe individually, but certainly not universally human, experiential, focused toward the need to express. I think like any good artist, Shakespeare took a challenge. He could write this better than somebody else. And the truth was that he could write almost anything better than almost anybody else. And the sonnets are evidence of that over and over again. It's a real interesting issue. No time thou shalt not boast that I do change. Thy pyramids, built up with newer might, to me are nothing novel, nothing strange. They are but dressings of a former sight. Let's take a look at some of the words in here and see if we can excuse me, open the sonnet up a little bit. What does the word newer mean in the second line? Thy pyramids, built up with newer might, to me are nothing novel. Now, what does novel mean here? New, right? New fashion. Something surprisingly new, essentially here. Not just new, but novel in our sense of a novel comment that was, or a novel experience. Unexperienced before. Nothing strange. They are but dressings of a former sight. What does he mean by that when he looks at time? And what does newer might mean? By pyramids built up with newer might.
New way.
Okay, if my footnote says, whether your footnotes say the same, say possibly a topical allusion, possibly to the pyramids erected on London streets as part of the pageant welcoming King James in 1603. So there were, wouldn't one have to see that as a topical allusion? New meaning recent strength. I'm not sure about that.
Well, it could be just if you threw them up again, I still wouldn't be all that impressed. If you built the real pyramids again.
Okay.
I mean, you've done it. It's old, and we admire that.
What if he's referring to the actual pyramids?
Yeah, that's what I mean.
No, I mean, as opposed to being done again, what does he mean for the literal one? How might Shakespeare refer to the pyramid of Cheops as newer might?
Nothing strange.
Nothing new, nothing strange about these.
They are the dressings of a former sight.
Okay, and what would the former sight be here?
But we've already seen them. We've already done it.
All right, it's been done before. It's nothing new. I have a temptation even to want to see these as not referring to anything recent, but compared to what he's talking about, any pyramid is simply something done, something already done. The poet is going to tend throughout the sonnets to want to say to us that anything that in fact decays with time is captured by time. What does not decay with time? Love, poetry. But the pyramids of ancient Egypt are in fact captured by time, and we know ourselves that they're decaying. Even today we read about it, partly now because of pollution. So what for us is an antique, ancient phenomenon is something which is, in fact, in long-term perspective, part and parcel of natural decay. But I think you're right. The first meaning, reading of these lines is that anything put up now is just a reminder of something past, a former sight. Our dates are brief, and therefore we admire what thou dost foist upon us that is old, and rather make them born to our desire than think that we before have heard them told. Now there's the second quatrain. There's some interesting lines here. Our dates are brief, our lives are short. Is that right? Okay. And because of that, we admire what you foist upon us that is old. Can somebody translate that in kind of modern, simple English? And what does foist mean? Okay, forced. We're forced to accept. Do we accept what is old just because it's old? Sure, because our lives are short themselves. I think foist is not a word. And we make them born to our desire, then think that we before have heard them told. What does that pair of lines mean? We make them born to our desire. Can someone make some sense of that? What do we think about things that are old? Okay, right. Since they're already there, and we're predisposed to admire them, we create them as though we wanted them to be. As we take the attitude, something old is something we would like to see, and they're born to be expressed to us. I also have thought about this line, if it doesn't mean that maybe we will to see all things in the egocentric context. Right? Why were the pyramids built? So I could go see them. Right, again. Obviously, what's the use of building them if only you guys go see them? Right? I'm the most important person.
They've lasted long enough so that when we're finally here, we can go and see them.
That's right. That we are the end product of that. Yeah. And this gets us to that fourth line. Then think that we before have heard them told. What does that mean? Okay, that we're seeing them for the first time. We don't want to think that, oh, other people have seen these pyramids. Right? Maybe Napoleon went there and took a look at them in 1801. And maybe I'm seeing them, therefore, secondhand, after they've served their purpose. Shakespeare's always interesting when he deals with the ego. And I can see the ego involved here.
This question, when he says that we before them people
I think he means that we prefer to think that they were created for us, rather than that we have heard this story of their creation on second hand, third hand, fourth hand. But he's talking in broad historical sense. I mean, he is speaking of the image in front of us is the pyramids. And people have been going to see the pyramids for centuries. But I want to think that they were created for moi. This piggy is the center of the universe. Thy registers, the third quadrant, and thee, I both defy. What does registers here mean? Registers is a calendar, right? A sequence of what is the history of time, chronology. He's saying essentially, I'm not going to submit myself to what you have defined as the chronological sequence of events. And moreover, I defy you, which is old time, not wondering at the present nor the past. For thy records, and records here relate to what were then? Registers. And what we see doth lie, made more or less by thy continual haste. What is the oddity of that last line? For thy records and what we see doth lie, made more or less by thy continual haste. What kind of lie does he mean by that?
The records are a year is a certain length of time, but it seems more or less. So the one would be years ago.
Interesting. Virginia, you picked
Thy continual haste is just beautiful line. Well, it's like that. Always at my back, I hear time's hurrying, winged chariot hurrying near. And
Rushing on.
Tempest fugitive.
Sure.
Time is always pushing.
Mm-hmm.
How does the continual haste of time make the record?
Well, it's like Ozymandias, king of kings, but that record didn't last because time crumbled it. But the pyramids so far are still standing.
I think we have a tendency to want to say statistics don't lie. Right? Records don't lie. And Shakespeare's point is, they lie all the time. Time makes the lie of history, especially history's stateliness. It's a stately progression, and we know that time flies. I think all of us here know time flies a lot quicker than we would like. Yeah, time has flown. This I do vow. Vow is a pledge, and this shall ever be. I will be true, despite thy sigh. The sigh here? What's that referred to? His own? What is the, I feel attached to the microphone once you start talking to it. It's like having a chain around my waist. I don't know. Do I need it? Can you hear me if I walk away from it? What is the sigh referred to then, in terms of the individual poet here, the man who's speaking?
The cutting down and the ending.
Okay, of his own?
Despite my own death.
Yes, despite my own physical death. The sonnet does distinctly set up at a subliminal level the shortness of his own lifespan versus time in its great expansion. And I find the image of the pyramid very strong. For his age and for our age, probably of all human creations, the pyramids are the symbol of eternal structures. They do not disappear. The pyramids are the last of the seven wonders, I think.
But don't you find that in the first line where he talks about thou shalt not boast that I do not change with time, that really there's a constancy about time, and that though it moves on and you move on and feel the pyramid your own, there's going to be a group coming on next that are going to have the same feelings that we do, or I do, or you do.
Except that this is the standard poet's refusal to accept. What is it? You go back to the first line. What is time going to say to him? Like everything else, I am in charge, and you will change. And the key word at the end of the poem is which one? The last line.
I will be true.
True. I'm not going to change, in spite of all of your efforts to bring me around through the natural progression.
And he was right. He himself is a pyramid.
Yes, and there's a lot of truth to that. Yeah.
Not withering away.
No. I'll be seeing him this weekend down in Ashland. I'm curious to know that. Did I tell you last week I'm going tomorrow morning at 6 to see, I'm taking a group of Eastside students with some other teachers to see Carlos and Cressida in translation. My first trip down there. That's a nice one. Very nice. Any other favorites that you don't want to miss? 71? No longer mourn for me when I am dead. Everybody found that? Let's read it through and see what comes in. No longer mourn for me when I am dead, and you shall hear the surly, sullen bells give warning to the world that I am fled from this vile world, with vilest worms to dwell. Nay, if you read this line, remember not the hand that writ it. For I love you so that I in your sweet thoughts would be forgot, if thinking on me then should make you woe. Oh, if, I say, you look upon this verse, when I perhaps compounded am with clay, do not so much as my poor name rehearse, but let your love, even with my life, decay. Lest the wise world should look into your moan, and mock you with me, after I am gone. This sonnet always reminds me of Christina Rossetti's Remember Me When I Am Gone Away from, you know that one? Far away into the silent land. She prays, don't forget me, but if you remember the poem, it says, but if you remember me and be sad, better by far that you should forget and smile, than that you should remember me and be sad. And a curious statement. It's a lovely poem on her part, but it's so reminiscent of this sonnet by Shakespeare. What attitude do you want of the people you leave behind? How close do you want your memory carried? I'm teaching William Wordsworth right now at school, and we did recently We Are Seven, you know the poem by Wordsworth, where the poet comes to the little girl who's 6 years old and says, how many brothers and sisters do you have, little girl? And she says, well, we are 7. Two have gone to sea, and two are in Conway, and two are dead. And the poet, who's the adult, who's gone through experience, says, no, little girl, if two are dead, it's 7 minus 2 is 5. So you're 5. She says, no, we're not 5, we're 7. And he says, your mathematics is wrong. Two are gone to heaven. Do you understand that? She says, well, all I know is that my brother and sister are buried over there 20 feet from our house, and I go out and I play with them, and I talk to them, and I do my sewing. And he says, little girl, don't you understand that 7 minus 2 is 5? She says, no, we are 7. No. And it's a classic Wordsworth poem where this girl has a different perception or perspective of what death is. I mean, it just does not mean loss to her. And the adult who has gone through experience says it's a mathematical problem. And we know that if you know Wordsworth, he is saying that she is right, and he himself, as the adult, is essentially in error here. And Wordsworth would love to go back to that. I think that the issue of how do you relate to those you've lost in love is a fascination to poets all the time. And this is one of Shakespeare's. This is a simpler sonnet than the one we just read. Don't you think? It's a fairly straightforward statement, so we probably don't have to look at it as closely. But let's hear it. No longer mourn for me when I am dead, then you shall hear the surly, sullen bell give warning to the world that I am fled from this vile world with vilest worms to dwell. So how long should you mourn? Right. And what is that? How long should the bell be ringing? Yeah, so in Shakespeare's day, right? No, don't ask for whom the bell tolls. If you remember, the custom was the sexton would ring the bell, and everybody would lie in bed or hold their breath to see who died. And it would ring until, and if it rang until it was 86, then you'd know that old Mrs. So-and-so is finally gone. It was a subtle way of communicating the news in his day. But Shakespeare says, however old it is that I am when I die, I want you weeping while the bell is ringing, and then let it go. What is a pretty obvious and a powerful word in the quatrain? Because he repeats it in, yes, vile. That's interesting. He repeats it in that fourth line. Yes, gives warning to the world that I am fled from this vile world with vilest worms to dwell. There are a couple elements in that are quite interesting to me. What is the verb that he uses here? Yes, and so what does fled tell you in terms of dying? You're running away from something rather than to something. It means that in the context of the verb, the place he's going to is better than the place he's come from, doesn't it? And so Shakespeare uses the word fled, attaches it to the vile world, but what's he going to?
Vile worms.
Vile worms. But even at that, which is the better of the two? Yes. So, right, and so therefore, there's no great reason to grieve. That is, Shakespeare is essentially saying in the language of this quatrain that he is better off where he is, so grieve while he's gone from this vile world to go to... But what's the form of vile when it's repeated here? It's a superlative, yeah. So as though the worms were worst. Dwell means to live with someplace. But it implies that even though he's saying these are the vilest worms, worse than the vile world, he's fleeing to them, which makes it, in the verb, a preferable place than this vile world, yeah. No, if you read this line, remember not the hand that wrote it. I'm modernizing some of the language. For I love you so that I in your sweet thoughts would be forgot, if thinking on me then should make you woe. Well, there's Christina Rossetti, right? Better by far that you should forget and smile than that you should remember and be sad. Fairly straightforward sentiment. I don't want you grieving over me. If happiness is what you need connected to forgiveness, then fine, we'll have that. Third quatrain. Oh, if I say, you look upon this verse, when I perhaps compounded am with clay, do not so much as my poor name rehearse, but let your love, even with my life, be paid. Lest the wise world should look into your moan and mock you with me after I am gone. A couple of words here we want to pull out. What does compounded with clay mean? To compound. Right, so what element is in the first quatrain is he picking up with that language? what do worms do to you after you die? Right, yes, they decay. He's keeping a subtle, not so subtle actually, consciousness on the reader's part of the decay of the body. And just as the worms will naturally participate in our physical decay, what's going to happen to our relationship with the land around us is going to be compounded. It's going to be mixed up, yes. Do not so much as my poor name rehearse, but let your love, even with my life decay. Rehearse means what here? What's the meaning of that? Keep saying it, okay? Don't, the way an actor rehearses his lines. Anytime you read the Sonnets, you want to keep your eyes open for a language that is language from the stage, because that's kind of interesting to see it appear. Lest the wise world should look into your moan and mock you with me after I am gone. The curious word here is wise. What does he mean by the wise world? Okay, yeah. But if I'm dead and you're saying, "Oh, Bill, you're gone forever," what will the sophisticates say? Right. And then what will they do?
Turn to their affairs.
They will turn to their affairs and say, "What an unrealistic woman this is, or man. Yes, that you're wasting your time," because the real world, in Wordsworthian terms, is well aware of decay, isn't it? And the experience knows. So don't put yourself in a position where the world can make you a butt of their experience as a result of your love for me. Mock you with me, meaning?
I'll make fun of your love for me.
Yeah. Let it go. Do you think that there is a touch in this little sonnet of, if you're going to grieve for me, do it quietly? Yeah, don't expose your grief to the sophisticates who are going to say what a fool that woman is, or that man is, to grieve over somebody who has turned into worms and clay. Do you grieve for clay? But that's what he is. I'm not sure that he's saying don't mourn for me. I think he is saying don't make a fool of yourself in public, because the public is going to look at you with its sophisticated wisdom and handle that. Any comments on that one?
Could you explain that third to the last line?
Let your love, that is, even as my life is decaying, and decay picks up the word of compounding with clay, doesn't it, and the worms, what you should do is allow your love to decay even as my body decays.
But you shouldn't.
He says you should. Yeah. He says.
But Gary, what kind of a person would mock somebody who's sincerely mourning a loss?
Wise people.
Well, there's a lot,
Yeah.
unconcerned.
Yeah. But I think he's talking about practical wisdom. That is the kind of person who would do it is somebody who says, "Hey, let's be realistic about this. She is gone." I don't know that song. You're revealing yourself as an unwise romantic. The facts of what's very strong in this sonnet for me is the visual imagery of decay, the fact of it, right? Worms, clay, decay, and the realist is going to say, "Hey, right? He's underground. You're free. Finally, go out and have a party. Right? Let him go." And he essentially is saying, "Go along with that."
Is that like a sensitivity?
Yeah. Yeah.
Expressing, yeah.
I think he's saying, don't make evident to the public any deeper feelings, because they're going to say this.
I think he's afraid that their love will be maybe destroyed, the love that they had by the one.
Well, she picked out the hard line though, because he essentially is saying you've got to let it evanesce.
But if you don't, that maybe you will begin to resent.
Well, what can you do? What's the alternative? Can you retain a deep affection or love for somebody who's dead? Can you go through life? Shakespeare says, let it. Well, maybe in your interior.
But didn't he last week say hold on to love?
Well, don't allow him to. Yeah. No, no poet has to be consistent.
Okay, so then you can take your pick.
Yeah, because you can find the one that fits you the best.
Because this was spent a lot of time on.
Except that the context is, for me, very much the public response. That is,
What's in your heart versus how
Right.
you show it.
I think what he's saying, the love here is the overt public affection. What you do not do when somebody's dead is go around the world and saying, "Oh, my husband's dead. You know, he's been dead 10 years. I can hardly stand it," because your friends are going to say, right, "I can't stand your company much longer unless you get on with the real world." And I think maybe all that decay means here is bring it into reality. There's a time of breastfeeding, and then there's a time of, all right, going on.
But you still hold the love in your heart.
Well, yeah. No, I'm not sure that I'm reading that in the sonnet.
Not in
I have a
this one,
tendency.
no, but
yeah.
I'm going
But I
back to
think,
read it.
yeah.
But it could be there, the one who is gone is not familiar with the other people and vice versa. So it's meaningless to someone who doesn't know the someone who's gone.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and so it's immaterial how you really feel if you're not aware of them.
Of which one? That
The
who
one that
is
has,
the you?
the world in general, and they will mock you if they don't know the person who has died and one
Sure.
of whom you
And
are
that will-
feeling very.
And if they do that, what it would do is also devalue and damage
Right.
the love you have.
Right.
You don't expose something like that to the world, which is going to ask for realism. Uh-huh.
Yes, my point is the same thing, Mark. Every day if you allow enough of this public, some people that prey on the person that they get into a deeper depression.
Well, he uses the word mock, but I think, so he doesn't quite bring in that experience, but I think it is part of the experience you have. Yeah, sure. I have a tendency to think, though, that what he's looking at in terms of the world is the phenomenon you've all experienced when somebody has experienced a serious loss, and initially you feel sympathetic and want to support it. And instead of allowing that grief to become climated into living and diminishing it and getting out in the world, they carry it on and carry it on and carry it on. And your friends will fall away from you if you do that. How long can you carry an aggressive grief around your community of relationships? And people are going to say, "I'm tired of seeing her. Every time I see her, all she does is say, 'Oh, life has just fallen apart since Bill died,'" you know. And then they will start making fun of you. And then the consequence is what happens to the seriousness of it. They'll leave you. And they will say, "Oh, you know, you've got to face reality." This is more complex than I thought, I guess.
Any kind of regret over something that has happened or inevitable, something happens and you need something, then the best thing to do is to realize that you have no control over
Yeah.
it.
Well, he's holding strongly up to us the fact that death is separation and decay. That's the fact of life. What do? Do you grieve? Yeah, but he says you grieve as long as the bell is ringing. And then what you do is you tie your belt a little bit tighter and you go out and don't allow the world to make mock of what is serious to you. He's not saying it's not serious, but you don't allow it to become the object of derision. Like people saying, "Oh, she never could survive after him. She's just gone on."
I think people are generally uncomfortable even if somebody is recently died,
Yeah.
and you have to go through, I think, most people before funeral,
Yes.
what am I going to say? If you're never really comfortable with showing working or having somebody else really be really feeling
But we do feel an obligation
Right,
in
well,
recent
carry
grief
that
to help.
to that,
But you know what your friend is going to say if you carry that grief on. 6 months later they're going to say, "She's still grieving, but you know, he wasn't such a..." Right? Because they won't see that person as you do. That's a... Well, doesn't he imply that if you continue on, the grief becomes self-pity? And then you start perhaps... The real pleasure is having people pat you on the back? Possibly. I think this is a fairly cool poem, however, towards emotion. It seems to me that the tenor of the lines is, hey, you know, buck up, face it, here's reality. This is how you survive in the world. It's a lesson poem as well. Interesting.
You have to do 73 with it now. 73
We did that last
because
fall, didn't we? Did we do that last fall?
we will do it again.
Yeah, we'll read it again. I won't analyze it line for line the way we did in the fall session.
Yeah.
Here he is looking around him to his beloved and pointing out that he is no longer a spring chicken. And this is the poem we talked about, which has this lovely shift of focus and imagery from the time of the year to the time of the day to the length of time of the fire, as he makes the shortness of time and his dying, imminent death, of course, come forth. That time of year thou mayest in me behold, when yellow leaves, or none, or few, would hang upon those boughs which shake against the cold, bare, ruined choirs, where late the sweet birds sang. In me thou seest the twilight of such day as after sunset fadeth in the west, which by and by black night doth take away, death's second self that seals up all in rest. In me thou seest the glowing of such fire that on the ashes of youth doth lie, as the deathbed whereon it must expire, consumed with that which it was nourished by. This thou perceivest, which makes thy love more strong, to love that well which thou must leave ere long. I won't go through this line by line. A couple of points. If you set it up against 71, you get an interesting contrast between how you approach death as a fact, when the person's already dead, and how you approach it as a heightening of sensitivity in its imminence. How do you respond to one who you know is going to die shortly? The odds are that Shakespeare wrote this in 1593, so he had another 20 years to live, so it wasn't an actual statement of his near death. But he raises the issue of how one responds. And his idea is, apparently, if you take the two sonnets together, that the imminence of death raises your sensitivity to love. You love even more, knowing it's going to go away. And then after you die, you control yourself, you bring yourself back. What I like especially in the sonnet is the complexity of that third quatrain, where he talks about what the expenditure of life is, and how it in me you see the glowing of such fire that on the ashes of his youth doth lie. An interesting concept. It reminds, of course you know that I always think about what I'm teaching currently, but it reminds me of Wordsworth's poems about the child as the father of the man. And that his age is a product of youth, the father of youth. And as in a fire, when you see a fire glowing in its final embers, what is glowing is the future ashes of the youth of that fire itself. So you consume yourself. Metaphysically, an interesting concept. Consumed with that which it was nourished by. You do not become aged in this sonnet without the experience of youth. And it's part of us. We carry it with us. When I come to poetry of this theme in class at school, I bring to the students pictures of my grandmother. I mentioned them to you in the past. I have photographs of her from roughly the age of 8. She was born in 1878, so 1885 or so. Her and her sister, from that age, the pictures of the two of them, to the 90s. And I bring them into class and say, here are two 10-year-old girls. Here are two 15-year-old girls. Here are 21-year-old women. Here are women in their 30s, in their 50s, in their 70s. Here they are in their 90s. And what's the connection between the 20-year-old woman in 1898 and the 90-year-old woman in 1970? Well, she's in there. Because high school students don't understand that you're not born 90 years old. Right? They think that if you're old, you've always been old, and that they are always going to be young. And you raise
It's not a bad idea.
Oh, it's very hard for them. I mean, you know this from your own experience with young people. They think youth lasts forever.
They're not going to get old.
No, they won't age. No. And some of them, they don't drive more carefully or maybe right. But Shakespeare picks up that idea that the life you are is fed by your youth. Your living creates your life. Your age is your youth in you. And of course, it's consumed, but it's still there. And metaphysically, it's a very interesting concept. And I like that part of the sonnet. It's a lovely sonnet. I think maybe his best sonnet. Certainly one that I've enjoyed teaching most over the years. One more sonnet before we take our coffee break. Something we can. Some, but not always some. There are sonnets that are linked, as the 3 sonnets I did last week dealing with the season. But the only reason these sonnets are given to us in the sequence that they are here is that the publisher published them that way. And scholars have tried for 300 years to say, well, obviously the publisher put them together in a random, pretty much random fashion with some sense that these go together, so that the first 20 sonnets, for example, all deal with have a child before you get old, and that's the central message of those 20 sonnets. The last sonnets deal with the Dark Lady. But there's no evidence whatsoever that Shakespeare intended these to be read in sequence. It's not a sonnet sequence the way the traditional Renaissance poets wrote sonnet sequences. So, yeah, in fact, before I started, I was taking a gander at that to see if it works. Why don't we read it, just to link the 3 as long as we're at this point. This is not one of the sonnets that people read with much affection. But 72, the one in the middle of these 3. Oh, lest the world should task you to recite what merit lived in me that you should love after my death. Dear love, forget me quite, for you and me can nothing worthy prove, unless you would devise some virtuous lie, to do more for me than mine own desert, and hang more praise upon deceased I than niggard truth would willingly impart. Oh, Shakespeare, he says you will have to lie to make your grief believable. And he says, and that being the case, I'd rather have you forget about me entirely, because I don't want you creating lies in memoriam of me. That's interesting.
It would almost be embarrassing for
Yes,
him, probably,
yeah.
that she's building up to.
Yeah, of course we know that from the egoism of the other sonnets that he thinks he is pretty good after all. So I suspect that this is more of an exercise than a real sentiment. You think so? To his wife. I meant to ask you, I was reading, I came across I was reading the biography of Shakespeare recently, and someone pointed out that his mother's name was Mary Arden. Isn't there a cosmetic called Mary Arden? Or there is? Oh, it's Elizabeth Arden. All right. Gee, it seemed that name seemed, Mary Kay Cosmetics, Elizabeth Arden. All right, I was wrong, but I knew you ladies would know it, Mary Arden.
Independently, or whether they ever incorporated again in plays?
The sonnets are not from the plays.
Not in any way.
No, the plays have their own lyrics. And what is love is not hereafter, present birth, present laughter. No, in fact, the lyrics do not appropriate themselves to the sonnets very nicely to me. So they're very nice. The lyrics for me, the lyrics in the plays have a tendency to be fairly lighthearted, and the sonnets have a tendency to get more serious in the words. But that's because the sonnets don't fit into the plays at all. The sonnet is a highly circumscribed form, and Shakespeare is working within the sonnet form, whereas the lyrics are usually meant to be recited by the fool, and they should be songs. Now, you know Shakespeare has other poetry. He wrote poems, the longer poems, as well as this. We have not done any of this. I don't know. Have you done any of the poetry? Did you do, for example, his Phoenix and the Turtle, or the Raven of Lucrece? Any of those? Passion of Pilgrim. Well, that's a mixture of material. Much of it is not certainly Shakespeare. But,
Was he writing
it's hypothetical. They assume it's in the 1590 to 1593 to 1596 period. And that is deduced evidence based upon the language he uses and the evolution of his style. But we do not know. The sonnets did not become public until 1609, I believe. He was alive at that time. He could have disavowed them. He didn't, so they're his sonnets. But it's obvious that the 154 sonnets were not all written at one time. It had to be a creation of his I would say several years of careful work in his spare time. It's clear that when he wrote the sonnets, he was a working man. He was writing plays for publication, for the stage. And so somebody picked them up, he passed them among his friends, somebody accumulated them and published them. But we do not know much about the sonnets. The fact is that they're there. We know they're Shakespeare's. The only two doubtful ones are the last two of the 154. The first 1 through 152 are accepted by critics as clearly Shakespeare. We have reference to the sonnets by his friends, but we have external evidence that he was a writer of sonnets. But Shakespeare didn't put them together in any sequence. The publisher probably did that. And every other possible sequencing of the sonnets for publication has been unsatisfactory. So what editors will always say, if you read the introduction to any of the various texts you have, is that, hey, all we've got is the way they came out. So read them and find your own best sequence. And I think that's the way to do it, personally. Time for coffee. Okay. Sure that we don't fail at least to read the most famous of the sonnets. But I think maybe for the second hour today, what we ought to do is go back to the beginning and look at a series of poems all pretty much in the same theme. And it struck me that the easiest grouping to attack right now would be the poems at the beginning, on 1 through 20. And so what I did was select a few of these poems. All of these poems deal with one essential statement. He's writing to his young man friend, who is the object. And this is a fairly traditional subject matter. So most of these poems are probably written in a schoolroom exercise fashion, though there is enough intensity in some of them to think that perhaps there's a real person involved here. Certainly critics want to believe that there is a real person. But the theme of 1 through 20 is the simple one I mentioned last hour. You are young, you are beautiful, you are single. Time is going to age you. Before you age, you should reproduce yourself in children. So the first 20 sonnets are poems which are essentially pleas to this beautiful young man to marry and produce children so that his beauty doesn't disappear with age and death. Now, I picked not random because I read them all, but I picked out a few that I thought it would be fun for us to look at and maybe get a sense of how he uses different imagery to deal with this single theme. Some of these are very good and some of them are not, and I tried not to pick those that I thought were not most interesting. Turn to Sonnet 3 first, and we'll run through these and catch some of the language of these. Sonnet 3. Look in thy glass. The glass here means mirror. Look in thy glass, and tell the face thou viewest. Now is the time that face should form another, whose fresh repair, if now thou not renewest, thou dost beguile the world, unblessed some mother. For where is she so fair, whose uneared womb disdains the tillage of thy husbandry? Or who is he so fond will be the tomb of his self-love, to stop posterity? Thou art thy mother's glass, and she in thee calls back the lovely April of her prime. So thou, through windows of thine age, shall see, despite of wrinkles, this thy golden time. But if thou live remembered not to be, die single, and thine image dies with thee. It's some curious sonnets in this batch. He frequently refers to this young man as a man who carries feminine beauty. Whoever he was androgynous in his physical appeal. And so here, for example, he's not referred to as carrying on his father's handsomeness, but his mother's beauty. And Shakespeare, as an older man, is enamored of this young man's beauty. This also has got a couple of touchy lines. We could maybe run through this fairly quickly. Look in thy glass and tell the face thou viewest, now is the time. In other words, do it before. Right, before, yes. You can look in a mirror now and you see a young face without lines, but if you don't say to that person who is yourself, reproduce yourself, it's going to be too late. So do it while you're young and beautiful, essentially. Whose fresh repair, if thou not renewest, thou dost beguile the world. What does beguile mean here? Deceive. Pull the wool over, I guess we would say, right? The world expects you to do your duty. Every man should do his duty. In this case, it means have a child. Let us beguile the world. And then he adds, the whole world expects your beauty to be reproduced. Right? That is, all of us who look at you. Unbless some mother. There's a male ego. Clearly. There's some woman who ought to be, right, the recipient of your marvelous beauty. And he asks the question, he pulls that point even further. Where is the woman who is so beautiful that her untilled womb, using a farming imagery here, I guess, disdains the tillage of thy husbandry? Right? So there's no woman here who's so beautiful. Even Raquel Welch, right, would love to have your children. You're the peer of number 10, whoever she is. And then he turns it right around to himself, doesn't he? And where is he that is so fond, and this is the old meaning of fond, meaning foolish, yes. It doesn't mean fond the way we use it as to like something. Fond is, up until very recently, always meant foolish, to be fond. So who is he who is so foolish that he will be the tomb of his self-love to stop posterity? The failure to have children here for Shakespeare becomes an extraordinarily egocentric act, isn't it? You are stealing from the succeeding generations the pleasure of viewing the beauty you carry in yourself. And so who is so self-loved, has so much self-love that they will bury that you have a duty to women and to posterity. So, yes, Linda.
Well, this is kind of terrible, but I remember watching television about sperm banks. They have people with really high
Uh-huh.
and there's a certain woman, I think she's real brilliant, and she would maybe have a child. I mean, that's sort of the idea.
Uh-huh. But that's the mental equivalent, I guess, here. He's not talking about intelligence. but yeah, the 20th century has reached the point where you can keep Linus Pauling going for generations and generations if it
Order up the Linus Pauling.
yes, yeah. I have real doubts that that's going to be the consequences of modern science. I think Linus Pauling probably have large numbers of really stupid children. Yeah. Oh, let's hope. Yeah. Thou art thy mother's glass. This means then you are the reflection of your mother. And glass here again is mirror. And she in thee calls back the lovely April of her prime. Obvious line, meaning, how old is she now? Well, she's obviously a generation older. If he's in his 20s, she's probably in her 40s maybe. And she can look at you and remember when she was April, the month of April, of her prime. That's a nice image. The neat thing about this little sonnet is he really is not bad at throwing a guilt trip on. Right? The point being, if she was generous enough to reproduce her youth, and then gave herself the pleasure of being able to see it in her children, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you doing the same thing? So thou through windows of thine age shalt see, despite of wrinkles. Despite means in spite of wrinkles. Yeah. This thy golden time. But if you want to live without being remembered, die single, and thine image dies with thee. I know, I've often wondered how a person would feel receiving a sonnet like that. Do you think a sonnet like this would have any influence on the young man, 22 years old? So, Shakespeare himself? Yes, he had several children. In fact, he had twins. In fact, he had children so much that his wife had children 6 months after they were married. So, yeah, that's what if you ever teach high school and you show a movie on Shakespeare, the movies have to address this point usually when they're doing biographical material, and they will say Shakespeare was married in January, and in June they had their first children, and all the kids in high school go. I did it myself in high school, and everybody went, wait a minute, there's something wrong there. And the movies never point that out.
Time doesn't change, does it?
No, it doesn't change at all. And that, of course, endears him to them. Life is going on. Yeah, I saw it handsomely.
There's nothing homosexual about his addressing poems to a man.
No.
His age.
No, in fact, he makes it very clear in the comment we looked at last week, number 20, that he's highly frustrated by the fact that the person he's addressing is a male. He holds a grudge against nature for creating such an extraordinarily beautiful person, and then, as he says, adding the one thing that I don't want. So, yeah. And moreover, this is it's harder for us, I think, than any age, well, the 19th and 20th century both, to understand that what he's doing here is a perfectly legitimate and almost universal Renaissance conceit. Homosexuality was not what we imagine it to be in his day, and it was very common for men to be enamored of beautiful men and not have anything sexual at all. It's not a sexual relationship. It is the same. It has something to do with the Renaissance concept of a person of the same sex being praised for beauty, raising the love to a level which is higher than ordinary heterosexual love or homosexual love. It's a purer love. It's a purer love. And this goes back in Western civilization, for generations. But we in the 20th century find it very touchy. I know that just as a person, I have a strong tendency to refer to the recipient of these particular sonnets as her. It feels like it ought to be written to a woman, but it's clear that it's not. But also, there's no physical relationship at all. This is the purest relationship, where you can. And I have no trouble with that intellectually. Maybe as a 20th century man, it's a little bit sensitive to me. But aside from that,
I wondered if the reason men in our society have a harder time establishing really close friendships than women do is because we have this strange taboo to feeling it.
it's very hard for young males because they desire love as much as anybody, and women have always had the ability to have a loving camaraderie among themselves without any cultural negative attitudes involved. But boys need it as well, especially before they move on into the adult world, and they are, the physical manifestation of that is in male athletic teams, where the only place where a 16 or 17-year-old is able to put his arms around another boy without it being negative. And they have an enormous need for affection. I know myself as a teacher, one of the ways you relate to students is to take advantage of your chance to use physical contact in a supportive way. And I know that for me, one of the reasons I get along with all the boys is that I go out of my way to establish a relationship with the kids who are tough. So that the real he-men kind of boys who are very sensitive about their maleness, they still need a touch. And as a teacher, I will come up and I'll put my hand on their shoulder or something, and they just glow at that kind of contact, not knowing that they're getting something other than just a pat on the back, which is, you are not repulsive to me, essentially, right?
Well, you could be emotional with them.
Yeah, and that can occur too, but I'm thinking on simply a more daily basis. There are people who they're raised by our culture to be highly negative to touch.
Well, I think with leadership, because we do that with, it's natural.
Sure.
Sure.
And we still have not reached the point where women cannot feel comfortable going down the street arm in arm. And we should recognize that this is an American problem. You go to Europe, and you'll see Italian men right down the street. They have very little of what we have.
And it's much healthier, Gary. It's much healthier. We have such a hang-up, and it's too bad.
Really
I love it in football games. For example, when the team makes a touchdown, 6 guys run in and hug, and they throw each other in the air, and they jump, and they're just so joyous together.
That's right.
But any other occasion they did that, wow,
That's right. Yeah.
frowned upon.
I think it might be one of the reasons for the American pleasure in contact sports. There is just contact, whether it's in athletic combat or just arm in arm, it's still contact, and people need to touch each other. Yeah. Yes, that's also controlled circumstances where people can be affectionate. I think I might have mentioned this too. I probably told you every tale in my life in the last 10 years. It hit me very strongly when I was in high school and came upon a book which discussed this issue. in particular in terms of private space. Americans have a much broader area of private space than other cultures do. And it addressed the reader and said, you know, if you're a male, think how many times you have physically touched your best friend. And I had a very good friend I played tennis with almost every day. I really loved this guy. And they said one of the oddities of our culture is that two men who are best friends in our culture almost never touch each other. Acquaintances you shake hands with, right? But somebody you see regularly you don't shake hands with. And I realized that I had never physically touched him. I never shook his hand. I never patted him on the back. We played tennis 4 times a week. And it was my really big awakening. And I would have felt uncomfortable doing it because I was an American teenager. That was not allowable. It was an interesting point. Yeah.
But Gary, I'll bet you kiss your son goodnight now and then.
Yeah.
You bet.
Yeah.
Well, some fathers can't even do that.
No, my son cannot sleep if I don't hug him and kiss him
Yeah,
goodnight.
that's great.
So, in fact, Sandy and I decided that both of our kids would get a lot of tactile love. And John, even if I have a cold, he wants to kiss me on the lips. And, we go through this. I have had a bad cold this winter, very debilitating, and every time I go to put him to sleep, Dad, come on in, and he's always, and I'm going like this, trying to get him to kiss me on the cheek so he doesn't touch it.
Does he feel any easier with his boy?
I do not know.
Social?
I do not know. He's a very popular boy.
Because none of the others are having any contact. It's hard for one to.
I suspect maybe the boys he plays with are more comfortable with their parents and with love anyway, just through the natural selection process. I know that John is going through a highly tactile age, a lot of wrestling, and violent, but violence which is really expressions of affection. He's still at the age where he doesn't have anything to do with girls whatsoever. So I can destroy him just by saying, oh, he's 11, so. I said the other night, oh, John, just thinking 4 years from now you're going to have all the girls chasing you. Oh, Dad! Pulls the covers over his head. So. Okay, Sonnet 4. Unthrifty loveliness. This sonnet is focused on inheritance, what you do with your legacy, how you handle your money. It's a financial sonnet. And I'm not sure it's a good one, but it's a curious imagery. He picks it up and works with it. Unthrifty loveliness, why dost thou spend upon thyself thy beauty's legacy? Right? So in other words, you have inherited this from your parents, and instead of passing it on, what do? That's right. Nature's bequest gives nothing, but doth lend. And being frank, she lends to those are free. Then, beauteous niggard, why dost thou abuse the bounteous largesse given thee to give? Profitless usurer, why dost thou use so great a sum of sums, yet canst not live? For having traffic with thyself alone, thou of thyself, thy sweet self dost deceive. Then how? When nature calls thee to be gone, what acceptable audit canst thou leave? Thy unused beauty must be tombed with thee, which used lives the executor to thee. Now, this I think is a good example of a sonnet which was pretty clearly a set piece. You got an idea. How can I handle a sonnet dealing with this topic in which all the references have to do with how you handle your money when it's given to you to work with, and you refuse to do it? I don't want to imply that it's a good one. I think it's a very mediocre sonnet. But it's still interesting to watch him play with language, and that's one of the challenges of the sonnet. Let's run through it fairly quickly here. Unthrifty loveliness, why do you spend upon thyself thy beauty's legacy? And you got that. Nature's bequest gives nothing but doth lend. What's that mean? Okay, nature doesn't give you your beauty for yourself. It lends it to you, and naturally, as a bequest, then you should pass it on. Right. And being frank, she lends to those are free. Frank here means generous, open. So nature intends to be generous to people who are equally generous themselves. And nature expects you to be generous with your beauty. Like Walt Whitman, who should have 6 illegitimate children in Louisiana, remember? So, pass it around. And then you get this curious, thin, beauteous nigger. What a curious term. Beauteous is a Wordsworth word, which I dislike intensely. But it's a curious conjunction, isn't it? What's a niggard?
A stingy
A stingy person, somebody who's niggardly with his money. So he says, here's a paradox, essentially. Nature intends beautiful people to be free and open. You are a paradox. You're a stingy person who is beautiful. Why do you abuse the bounteous largesse given thee to give? And you abuse this largesse means a large amount of gift. And what is the nature of the abuse then? Since it was given to you to give, you have abused it by keeping it, not passing it around. And he likes the paradoxes in the sonnet. Profitless usurer. What is a usurer? A moneylender, and moneylenders are out for profit, and so they lend money to make money. And here's a person who has been given money to make money, to make a profit, pass it out, make it increase, and it's a total failure. Yes, it's profitless. Why do you use so great a sum of sums, yet canst not live? Here it means, why do you use this much money, but don't make a living at it, or don't survive through posterity? That is, you're not creating life. Even though you have this enormous amount of beauty, it's to no effect and no avail. It doesn't produce life at all. For, having traffic with thyself alone, traffic here would refer to what? Business, sure, the way, as we would say, drug trafficking. Yeah. So you being your own purchaser of your own money, keeping the money imagery going. You of yourself, thy sweet self doth deceive. What does that mean? You deceive yourself of your own sweet self. Okay. So what's the nature of deception then? Yeah, okay, you think that it's going to last forever, and you're not. You're going to lose the self which could be reproduced to your children, and you're deceiving yourself. You've got to spend it. What acceptable, then how, when nature calls you to be gone, in other words, yeah, what acceptable audit canst thou leave? The CPA is going to come to check your books, right? What are they going to find when they audit your books? Nothing there, no profit. This sonnet always reminds me of the parables in the Bible, right? Where the talents, right? And God gives, and one person sticks it in the ground and comes back and says, here's the one talent you gave me. And what does God say? I didn't give you that talent to put it in the ground, right? I expect to get something back. And do you suppose that Shakespeare has this in mind? I think he's very much thinking of it. If I give you that, you put it out at risk, and you come back with a profit and show that you've actually used it. Thy unused beauty must be tuned with thee, which use it lives the executor to be. The executor here would be the, okay, right. If you use your beauty, it will become the executor of the beauty you leave behind you. There's also playing on what word here? No, it's not executor. This is a more common word. Use it. Use your reed, right? So, yes, if you use it, your money, it would become a...
Does this remind you at all of Polonius playing with the word tender when he was quoting the Juliet and with him, and he used the word tender 5 times at once. And he said, first he referred to it as something he could do tenderly or fool, and then it's really quite marvelous.
The speech has not come to my mind, but it would not surprise me.
Well, I used to put it on the board, and just put down those key words, and I said, what would you think this was in? And they said, in a balance sheet. And it was a father's advice to his...
Sure. He would never, Shakespeare, if we talk about his personal traits, one of his traits is to take advantage of every pun he can get a hold of. And if he can use double meaning for words, he will do it, and that's a classic case, as he's doing it right here with use and usury. So, yeah, they say puns, your love of puns is a sign of intelligence. We give that to him. Let's look at another one in this line, number 5. Those hours that with gentle work did frame the lovely gaze, where every eye doth dwell, will play the tyrants to the very same. and that unfair which fairly doth excel. For never resting time leads summer on to hideous winter, and confounds him there. Sap checked with frost, and lusty leaves quite gone. Beauty o'ersnowed and bareness everywhere. Then were not summer's distillation left a liquid prisoner, pent in walls of glass. Beauty's effect with beauty were bereft, nor no remembrance what it was. But flowers distilled, though they with winter meet, lose but their snow, their substance still lives sweet. There's a sonnet I had not really pulled out to look at it closely until this morning when I was kind of rereading things for today. And it just popped up to my eyes. I thought, what a nice little sonnet this is. And I like it very much. It has to do with, of course, the seasons, but he's talking about beauty essentially. These hours that with gentle work did frame the lovely gaze. Okay, it took a long time to create your current beauty, obviously, but they're going to play the tyrant for the same, because even as it took years to create your beauty, what's going to happen? The years will continue to go on, and they'll take away exactly what you left. Never resting time leads summer on to hideous winter, and confounds him there. Nice 2 lines, isn't it? What does it mean to confound? Destroy. Yes, undercut as well, I think that's right. Time is going to lead summer on to winter and then destroy him. And the destruction, of course, of summer by winter means the destruction of life. The flowers, the grass, the trees. Sap checked with frost. Checked means ceased, yes. And lusty leaves, quite gone. Beauty o'ersnowed, and bareness everywhere. Interesting concepts here. The first one is stopping something, and then the absence, right? That is absence being quite gone. The next line is covered up, snow, beauty covered over with snow, and the last is total absence, right? Bareness everywhere. And then you get to kind of difficult lines. It's not that hard though. Then were not summer's distillation left a liquid prisoner, pent in walls of glass. How do we get summer's distillation pent in glass bottles? Okay, it would be perfume, wouldn't it? It would be how you take the beauty of the smell of summer and take its essence, right? Boil it down. And so you can still get the odor of summer in winter by having in your possession this glass of the essence of roses, let's say. Huh? Beauty's effect with beauty were bereft. That is, we would not be able to have any beautiful effects in the dead of winter without the presence of perfume, which is there. But flowers, no remembrance what it was. You wouldn't even recall. But instead, you take the odor, flowers distilled. Though they with winter meet, he says lees, but he means lose, but their show, their substance, their sweet. How does that fit the series of the first 20 sonnets? How does it fit the theme after that? I think so, yeah. While you're young, you distill your beauty, because time will go on, and then the memory of your beauty will be the children that you have in your middle age and their youth. Let's make our way up to a couple others here. Number 9. Did he think he did? Did you think the man did? No, I have a feeling that the more of these sonnets you read, the more you realize this is a pretty fickle and unsubstantial person he's writing to. There's plenty of evidence from the other sonnets that the man who's writing is not a substantial person, nowhere near as valuable as Shakespeare would make him out to be. But then who's to account for love? The question number 9 is, why are you still single? Okay. Is it for fear to wet a widow's eye that thou consumest thyself in single life? Why are you not marrying? Because you don't want to, when you die, leave a widow crying. So you're doing it out of kindness to the poor woman who would be so bereft at your death. If thou issueless shall have to die, the world will wail thee like a makeless wife. Makeless is mateless, yeah, going back to the old. In other words, if you don't die because you don't want to leave one woman, a widow, in tears, if you don't marry and you die without children, the whole world will be weeping like a makeless wife. The world will be thy widow, and still weep that thou no form of thee hast left behind, when every private widow well may weep by children's eyes, her husband's shape in mind. All individual women may do what then? The private widows. They may weep, but what are they going to be weeping by? They're by their children. In their children they will see their husbands. Look what an unthrift in the world doth spend, shifts but his place, for still the world enjoys it. But beauty's waste hath in the world an end. Finish it. And kept unused, the user so destroys it. No love toward others in that bosom sits, that on himself such murderous shame commits. The flame involved here. He compares the person who's refusing to marry and produce children with a thriftless person. What is the difference? Somebody who's unthrifty. Look what an unthrift in the world doth spend, shifts but his place, for still the world enjoys it. What does it mean? What is an unthrift who spends his things in the world? He says all you do is shift but your place. In terms of money, what's he talking about? Still the world enjoys it. We got $30 million left here in Seattle over the weekend by the NBA. All the unthrifty people who came here and threw their money away on pennants and T-shirts. What did they do? Well, they spent it and they transferred the money from Houston to Seattle. So, right? I mean, so it's perfect. The world will still enjoy the pleasure of their money. It's just that it's in a different bank. And so that kind of spending apparently seems perfectly all right. But beauty's waste hath in the world an end. You see the point? You waste money, somebody else pick it up and spend it. It's not lost. Maybe put to good use tomorrow by somebody else. But if you who do not reproduce yourself in your beauty, therefore waste it, it is gone forever. Interesting. And kept unused, a user so destroys it. He likes paradox as well, doesn't he? So the failure to use destroys by its use in that fashion the beauty that is so important. And this sonnet ends with an actual accusation. Did you notice that? Unlike some of the others which are pleas, this one it sounds as though he's losing his temper a little bit toward this man. No love towards other in that bosom sits, that on himself such murderous shame commits. In other words, what kind of a person are you? Yes, murderous shame. Okay, let's look at one of the really fine sonnets from this period. This is, I think it's one of my two favorite ones in your opening section, number 12. I think I like these because I have a bias towards those that use nature imagery, scenery and season imagery. When I do count the clock that tells the time, and see the brave day, and think the hideous night. When I behold the violets past prime, and sable curls all silvered o'er with white. When lofty trees I see bare in the breeze, with hurst from heat did canopy the herd, and summer's green, all girded up in sheaves, borne on the beard, with white and bristly beard. Then of thy beauty do I question, that thou among the wastes of time must go, since sweets and beauties even self forsake, and die as fast as they see others grow. And nothing against time's sigh can make defense, save breathe, to brave and haste the defense. I like the emotion of this sonnet very, very much. So many of those lines are such nicely common and beautiful words as you look at images of change in nature around him and us. It starts out with a statement of time passing. When and I do count the clock that tells the time. And then he moves from that chronological image to the reality of how time passing. You have a pendulum clock in your houses. We've got two of them. Tick away all the time. And see the brave day sink in hideous night. Well, there are two power words here, obviously, that set the tone. Brave and hideous. Yeah. The day in its greatness faces itself with power, with strength. But nothing can prevent the clock from taking that day. Right? That time is taking the day we're in right now. And what does hideous add to it? If the day is brave, and I assume the brave day is 9 o'clock in the morning when it's up and at 'em, let's go out and do something. What does hideous here? What kind of emotion does hideous carry? Revulsion. Yeah, very worse than unattractive, isn't it? I mean, it's a strongly intense one. When I read this, I'm reminded of Emerson's poem on days in contrast. Where you remember the poem we did Emerson? The daughters of time, they look pretty days, muffled and dumb like barefoot dervishes. They come and offer him anything he wants, right? Bread, stars, bread, the sky that holds them all, he says. And all he takes and has taken day after day is a few herbs, right, and apples. And as the day goes away, he looks back, and under her solemn fillet I saw the scorn. Remember the poem? Emerson says, I continually opt for, well, I'm not up to it today. I'll just have 3 apples and a couple herbs. And the day offers you every day in its opportunity anything you want. But we always take the lesser of it. What that poem does not do is turn the vision of the end of the day into this horrifying concept that Shakespeare is giving us of the hideous night, the nothingness of it. Emerson tends to believe there's another day that's going to come along tomorrow. We can try again, but this one seems to give us a sense of death, or the night as death, from which there's no return. And the thrust of these opening sonnets is to argue to the man that he's speaking to that you're going to die and then it's over unless you reproduce. That seems to be very final here. When I behold the violet past prime, what does prime mean? Okay, yeah, the prime of Miss Jane Brodie. It's all downhill from there. And sable curls, all silvered o'er with white. What does he mean by that? You see hair, yes, gray hair coming through. When lofty trees I see barren of leaves which erst from heat did canopy the earth. Interesting concept, because so many of the lines in the sonnet are lines which set up the peak, right? The violet in its prime, declining. Sable, what is sable, by the way? Color. Okay, so you get the colored hair against which gray hair is most visible. And he turns to trees, and what kind of trees are they? They're trees deciduous trees which in July were completely covered and so thick in their leaves that the cattle could go under them to get shade, and now they're totally bare. Summer's green, all girded up in sheaves. Referring here to
The harvest.
the harvest, yes. But it's summer's green. It's the season's harvest, not a few acres or a farm, but everything finally put together in its ending. Born on the bier with white and bristly beard. Beer, of course, is the death. Then of thy beauty do I question me. When all of these things happen, I think, what is going to happen to you? And it's clear that the person he's writing to is at that peak of beauty. If all other things in nature, after a peak of beauty, descend into decay, what's going to happen to you? A logical structure here, isn't there? I question me that thou among the wastes of time must go. Question here means I consider, I believe, yes, I pose it as a question, will you not also go into the waste of time? Since sweets and beauties do themselves forsake and die as fast as they see others grow. Nothing against time's side can make you can say breathe. There's a conclusion. I don't think this poem ends as nicely as others. Now, particularly, I find the breathe is rather unpleasant. For me, breed is an animal term, but he's using it in that, maybe it's Shakespeare. I just give him the freedom. He's speaking in natural terms throughout the sonnet, isn't he? In terms of nature, and brave is a nature term. To brave him when he takes thee him. What does brave him mean? Defy, yes, it means to defy time when it comes to decide to reach his arms. The sadness about this poem is our knowing that Shakespeare himself had no descendants. That all of his the farthest in generation that his own children went was to his grandchildren. His line died out about 50 years after he died. And so there are no people today carrying Shakespeare's own blood. He does have ancillary descendants from a sister who married. One line in the family. So if you run across somebody named Hart in England, it may be a descendant of Shakespeare's sister, H-A-R-T. Okay, we're moving on, nearly the end here. Let's read one more and then call it a day today. Number 15. I like this one too. When I consider everything that grows holds in perfection but a little moment, but this huge stage presenteth naught but shows, whereon the stars in secret influence comment. When I perceive that men as plants increase, cheered and checked even by the self-same sky, vaunt in their youthful sap, at height decrease, and wear their brave state out of memory. Then the conceit of this inconstant stay sets you most rich in youth before my sight, where wasteful time debateth with decay, to change your day of youth to sullied night, and all in war with time for love of you. As he takes from you, I engraft you new. So nuttier sonnet. You don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but one reason I like it is that this sonnet tends to turn more toward himself. Did you catch the difference here, the slight shift in focus? When I'm feeling all of this, I turn to you for support or defense. I turn to your youth for defense against it. And I have a feeling that this is one of those sonnets that, for me, indicates more of an actual statement of the poet as opposed to an exercise. That he's quite sensitive to the opening line. When I consider everything that grows holds in perfection by a little moment. How long do things stay perfect? Nothing. A moment, a little moment. Yeah. And that idea of grabbing onto it, this is a prevision of the Romantic period, obviously, Wordsworth and Coleridge. The great romantic dilemma is how those moments just do not stay with us. And he gives us examples of it. In the third line, one reason I guess I think it's a more personal statement is that he picks right up on the stage imagery. Here's imagery out of his own work. That this huge stage presenteth naught but shows. What's the huge stage? The world. And he uses naught but, that the world we live in is nothing but appearances, right? Nothing but appearances. I wonder if he thought his own plays were nothing but appearances. Whereon the stars in secret influence comment. What's that mean? This world is just a series of shows upon which the stars, without telling us, in secret influence comment. What's that mean? Can somebody pull it apart a little bit? That's astrological.